Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I hope you've all been having a nice, relaxing weekend. And today I'm talking about the 2022 Olivia Wilde directed thriller, Don't Worry, Darling. Written by Katie Silberman, based on a spec script originally written by the Van Dyke brothers back in 2019, it centers around a young woman played by Florence Pugh, who lives in a very sort of idyllic, Pleasantville-style company town with her friends, and is a seemingly perfectly happy little housewife until one day she starts noticing weird things transpiring around the community that makes her begin to question her circumstances. First of all, on the positive side, I don't think this is 38% bad as it sits on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't think it's that poor of a film, not even close. I do find it ultimately disappointing. I'm going to get to that, but I still think it has a lot more merit than it initially got when it was released. And unfortunately, the release seemed to be obstructed and mired by all the controversy surrounding the production. And I will admit that I was generally a little bit oblivious to that when it was all going down and it was all kind of spilling over in the press, mainly because that side of the business just really doesn't interest me, honestly. I'm well aware that these things happen on productions, when you've got passionate people working together and there's studio pressure and public demand. It's inevitable, like every once in a while someone's going to boil over. It's just human nature. These things happen. But it still isn't anything that I'm interested in digging into unnecessarily, so there you go. At any rate, for at least the first hour of this movie, I was with it like all the way. That's largely a credit to Olivia Wilde as a director and also Florence Pugh as our lead actress here. Obviously, this isn't the first time Olivia Wilde has been in the director's chair, but this is the movie that makes me really sort of stand up and take notice and think to myself, like, wow, you're a real full-blown visionary filmmaker. Cool. She creates such a confident, foreboding air of mystery and intrigue and threat in this movie that it's the sort of stuff that guys like Alfred Hitchcock and David Lynch would be proud of. In particular, she stages one sequence that involves Pugh getting put in, shall we say, a tight situation that legitimately caught me out of nowhere. I had nothing but admiration and gratitude and pleasure for how well this was set up. It's a brilliant moment and a wonderful shot. Florence Pugh just carries this movie like a force of nature. She is always on point. She never steps wrong for a single second in a single scene. I was invested in her character. I was intrigued. She's very good at suggesting someone who is probably a bit smarter and more observant than her circumstances permit her or even require her to be. Even in the early scenes where her character is still a little bit more blissfully unaware of what's happening, she does a good job of creating someone who still feels like a person who clearly has happily resigned themselves to this domestic life that they're living. But even if she is deep down a little more smart and independent than her circumstances, she also doesn't seem to see any particular reason to be more ambitious because every day consists of nothing but instant gratification for her. She just builds her character's tension and unease scene by scene, beat by beat, so gradually, so subtly. She is just like a conductor waving a wand or a composer writing a great crescendo. It is pitch perfect work. Just like she demonstrated in Midsommar, Pugh is always able to make you really feel her fear and anxiety. That's what carried a lot of that movie and this one too. The situation feels scary because she makes you feel it. And Olivia Wilde gets great performances from the rest of her cast across the board. She's very good herself. Chris Pine is excellent as Frank. Nick Kroll and several other recognizable actors are very good in their supporting parts. And I don't know if this constitutes a hot take or not, but for all the fuss around Harry Styles, you remember maybe when the movie was released, every other hit or blurb or anything that came online all seemed to be, oh, Harry Styles sucks, Harry Styles sucks, Harry Styles sunk, don't worry, darling, Harry Styles, yeah. Big fuss. He's fine here. He's perfectly fine. His performance isn't quite as memorable as Florence Pugh's, but on the other hand, it doesn't have to be. All he really has to do here is essentially serve as an adequate foil for her, and he fills that without any problems, in my opinion. And watch for the scene at the center of the movie where Florence Pugh and Chris Pine have a very tense confrontation in front of an entire group of people at dinner. The acting, the direction, and honestly even the dialogue in that particular scene is about as good as thrillers can get. I really felt like this movie had everything in place. I was so invested. That first hour, I was thinking all the negative things that I've heard about this one, not true. And then things started to drag a little bit curiously in like the third act of the movie for a bit. And then we finally got to the climax, and when all was revealed, I was so incredibly let down. I had been sitting there wondering to myself, wow, this is all just so fascinating and mysterious and tense. How is Olivia Wilde going to pull this all together? What's she going to do with it? And the answer turned out to be nothing much. Yes, there is an ending, and yes, things are quote unquote tied up. And yes, everything is, I guess, essentially explained. But it's done in such a fast, tidy, derivative way. I was completely deflated, and at the risk of sounding a little bit dramatic, almost a little bit betrayed in a way. The way that it ends, it essentially means that all that great tension and mystery and atmosphere and confidence that Olivia Wilde was directing this movie with in those earlier passages, the reason that they were being so minimal on the exposition, which in the moment I was appreciating, was actually because if you got too much of a hint too early on as to what the secrets were, you wouldn't want to finish watching the movie. The climax of the movie was painfully derivative, like I almost had to rub my eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And even though everything does more or less wrap up, as I said, there are still some curious loose ends. For example, I'll stay vague for people who haven't seen the movie, but in the moment when the Florence Pugh character first sees something that kind of sends her down her path of discovery in the earlier act of the movie, yes, when you find out what was really going on, I guess that does technically explain that, but it still doesn't really give you any notion of how that happened or why it happened. I know I'm being very vague and this probably sounds confusing and simplistic, but if you've seen the movie and you know the moment that I'm referring to, I think you'll know what I mean. For that matter, there's aspects of Chris Pine's interest in the Florence Pugh character that feel unresolved and not fully explored. His character's final scene in this movie also feels like it kind of comes out of left field, because it sort of happens based on something that to me feels like it should have been hinted at or being developed a little bit more presently in the earlier passages of the movie. It just feels like there are some strands to this screenplay that got dropped and just sort of brushed aside as soon as Katie Silberman got a hold of it. Which is, I think, where the major leak in the boat lies for me as far as the creative team goes here. I don't like to go pointing fingers or lay blame at anyone's feet, but it's so jarring when this movie just kind of peters out and goes a really bland route in the climax that it's hard for me not to feel like the original screenplay that the Van Dyke brothers wrote was more bold and ambitious and provocative. Because look, in this movie's final form, I feel like the 2-hour runtime is too much for where the story ultimately goes and how much there actually is to it. A more lean 90-minute runtime, and I feel like I say that kind of thing all the time, but it's true, most movies are still too long, in my opinion. Anyway, 90 minutes would have served this kind of a story, I think, more effectively. It still wouldn't have made it the most jaw-droppingly original thing ever, but it would have given it a little more punch. But at 2 hours, it's too long for that. And with some of those loose ends that I mentioned, it's hard for me not to wonder whether or not the Van Dyke brothers' original screenplay was maybe more in like the 3-hour range. But I mean, regardless of how long it was, it's hard for me not to escape the suspicion that the original screenplay was a very bold and provocative and ambitious masterpiece. Instead, what we get is still at least a confident showcase for Olivia Wilde's abilities as a director. Honestly, it's kind of a shame because what she does here would have completely distinguished a worthier final screenplay. Which again, I think they already had before they brought Katie Silberman in, but can't change that now. But her direction, along with the cinematography and the performances that she gets out of her cast, make this at least worth a look, even if it isn't quite the unfairly maligned masterpiece that I was hoping it was going to be for at least, again, the first hour of the movie. And yeah, it really kind of broke my heart, I'm not gonna lie. There's also one little recurring motif that feels so blatantly ripped off from Get Out that I'm surprised that with all the other controversy that Jordan Peele didn't slap them with a copyright suit. I hate to get soapboxy, but it really astonishes me that nobody who saw sort of the initial cut for this before it was released, not a single studio executive stood up and said, that is a blatant ripoff, take it out of there. That's what I think creates my own personal sense of controversy with this movie, is that the good parts are fantastic and the bad parts are ludicrous. But I would love to see what else Olivia Wilde does in the thriller genre. I really think that she has a very inspired and sure hand for this kind of material. I would only suggest that maybe in the future, granted I was not inside anyone's head when they were making this movie, but based on my experience, it's hard not to feel like somewhere along the way someone got cold feet in terms of where the original screenplay took its ending. I'm not overly familiar with Katie Silberman as a screenwriter. I know she's also listed as a producer on this one. Based on what I would sort of surmise to be her contributions and alterations to the original script, she writes like a producer, and unfortunately, that's not a compliment. Especially in that climax where we get things that feel so much like a studio executive grumbling and insisting that there be some crowd-pleasing tropes in there that you can almost literally hear the gears grinding when it happens. I can honestly picture some studio exec watching this or reading the screenplay and scratching his head with a furrowed brow, and then suddenly having a eureka moment and exclaiming to the director and the writer, "You know what this movie needs is a car chase." I don't think that's actually what happened in this case. Again, given that Silberman is credited as both a writer and a producer, I feel like this all would have filtered through her creatively for the most part, which means that I can't even in this instance really blame studio interference at all. This is, as nearly as I can tell, the way that Silberman wanted it to be. On the off chance that you're watching Katie Silberman, that would just be in a nutshell my advice to you is next time, don't be scared to steer dark material into even darker territory. While this movie is ultimately a swing and a miss for me, I've rarely enjoyed the swing leading up to the miss this much. And, just take it as a compliment when I say this is the most disappointed I have been to not like a movie more in probably at least 2 or 3 years. And with that, here come the spoilers. Okay, so now I can finally stop tiptoeing around the climax and talk about it. So when Florence Pugh's character finally figures out that she's in the Matrix, sorry about that, when she finally figures out that she's been living in a virtual reality that her husband essentially sold her into against her will, it explains it, but again, I was like, that's it? Virtual reality? They're just kind of living in a Dollarama Matrix in a hospital somewhere? After all that tension and mystery and creating all this intrigue about characters' relationships, all of that and all the impressive production design and technical strengths that went along with that, just kind of for poof. And I know that that was kind of the point, but at least for me, when the movie is asking me to pay attention to all these little details and be curious about what people are up to and sort of be fascinated and intrigued by what could be lurking beneath the surface for all these various neighbors, To find out that it was all essentially just like, a big smoke screen, it lets me down because it ultimately makes all of that feel like it was just kind of a hollow exercise. I almost feel like on some level Olivia Wilde understood that as a director anyways, because she really does not put a lot into visually realizing that part of the story. I also don't understand why anyone would leave a briefcase with incriminating information in it wide open for a room to see, especially with what is apparently at stake for these guys. It's not just that it once again feels a little bit derivative of how Chris has his revelation partway through Get Out. It's also another one of those things that feels like an unfinished detail or something that wasn't quite tied off properly as soon as Katie Silberman assumed ownership of this screenplay. Because look, if it all is just virtual reality, how hard would it be to find some way to write into the algorithm something where these ladies can't visualize the names that are written on these folders or something like that? Or, Jesus Christ, why not leave the stupid thing in your car, numbnuts? If it's all just VR, essentially, there's a million easier ways to hide that information from the ladies. And when that final chase scene up to headquarters, complete with a ludicrous crash, goes down, I could not have been hanging my head any lower. It was so cheap and by the numbers, and it was not worthy of even some of the lesser parts of what had preceded this in the movie. Well shot and staged enough, but it felt more like something out of a James Bond movie. And for where it ends up with her sprinting up to the top of the hill and touching the headquarters door herself anyways, I honestly don't know why they felt it was necessary. Again, it just feels like someone very arbitrarily said, I think this scene needs a car chase, put one in. For where it ends up with Florence Pugh putting her hands on the headquarters button to escape back into the real world, it doesn't really matter whether there was a chase or not. I mean, the only reason I can think is that someone, for some reason, thought it was dictated that a climax has to include a big car chase. It would have been like at the end of The Truman Show if, instead of rocking the waves around and creating a storm to try and intimidate Truman into staying, Ed Harris's character sent a bunch of Navy SEALs on jet skis after him, firing machine guns and lobbing grenades, and he sprints and jumps like a superhero through the door out into the real world at the end. To feel this engrossed and then this sort of let down is obviously pretty crappy, but even with that in mind, I still don't necessarily regret watching this movie. In fact, its visual style and production design are triumphant and distinct enough that I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if this movie turns into a cult classic in coming years. But I honestly do feel like this movie had the potential to be, like an awards contender. But in the end, I feel like too many cooks in the kitchen syndrome and a severe case of cold feet ended up hindering the movie. That's about all I have to say about this one. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'm planning to do some Indonesian content in the coming days. Keep your eyes tuned to the channel for that, and I will catch you later.